Intelligence community to do its job without political influence. We briefed all relevant parties involved in terms of what was taking place. When we had a consensus around what had happened, we announced it, not through the White House, not through me, but rather through the intelligence communities that had actually carried out these investigations. And then we allowed you and the American public to make an assessment as to how to weigh that going into the election. And the truth is that there was nobody here who didn't have some sense of what kind of effect it might have. I'm finding it a little curious that everybody's suddenly acting surprised that this looked like it was disadvantaging Hillary Clinton, because you guys wrote about it every day. Every single leak. About every little juicy tidbit of political gossip, including John Podesta's risotto recipe. This was an obsession that dominated the news coverage. So I do think it's worth us reflecting how it is that a presidential election of such importance, of such moment, with so many big issues at stake and such a contrast between the candidates, came to be dominated by a bunch of these leaks. What is it about our political system that made us vulnerable to these kinds of potential manipulations, which, as I've said publicly before, were not particularly sophisticated. This was not some elaborate, complicated espionage scheme. They hacked into some Democratic Party emails that contained pretty routine stuff. Some of it embarrassing or uncomfortable, because I suspect that if any of us got our emails hacked into, there might be some things that we wouldn't want suddenly appearing on the front page of a newspaper or a telecast, even if there wasn't anything particularly illegal or controversial about it. And then it just took off. And that concerns me, and it should concern all of us. But the truth of the matter is that everybody had the information. It was out there, and we handled it the way we should have. Now, moving forward, I think there are a couple issues that this raises. Number one is just the constant challenge that we are going to have with cybersecurity throughout our economy and throughout our society. We are a digitalized culture, and there is hacking going on every single day. There's not a company, there's not a major organization, there's not a financial institution, there's not a branch of our government where somebody's not going to be fishing for something or trying to penetrate or put in a virus or malware. And this is why for the last 8 years I've been obsessed with how do we continually upgrade our cybersecurity systems. And this particular concern around Russian hacking is part of a broader set of concerns about how do we deal with cyber issues being used in ways that can affect our infrastructure, affect the stability of our financial systems, and affect the integrity of our institutions, like our election process. I just received a couple weeks back, it wasn't widely reported on, a report from our Cybersecurity Commission that outlines a whole range of strategies to do a better job on this. But it's difficult because it's not all housed. The target of cyber attacks is not one entity, but it's widely dispersed, and a lot of it is private, like the DNC. It's not a branch of government. We can't tell people what to do. What we can do is inform them, get best practices. What we can also do is to, on a bilateral basis, warn other countries against these kinds of attacks. And we've done that in the past. So just as I told Russia to stop it and indicated there will be consequences when they do it, the Chinese have in the past engaged in cyber attacks directed at our companies to steal trade secrets and proprietary technology. And I had to have the same conversation with with President Xi, and what we've seen is some evidence that they have reduced, but not completely eliminated, these activities, partly because they can use cutouts. One of the problems with the internet and cyber issues is that there's not always a return address, and by the time you catch up to it, attributing what happened to a particular government can be difficult, not always provable in court, even though our intelligence communities can make an assessment. What we've also tried to do is to start creating some international norms about this to prevent some sort of cyber arms race, because we obviously have offensive capabilities as well as defensive capabilities. And my approach is not a situation in which everybody's worse off because folks are constantly attacking each other back and forth, but putting some guardrails around the behavior of nation states, including our adversaries, just so that they understand that whatever they do to us, we can potentially do to them. We do have some special challenges because oftentimes our economy is more digitalized, it is more vulnerable, partly because we're a wealthier nation and we're more wired than some of these other countries. And we have a more open society and engage in less control and censorship over what happens over the internet, which is also part of what makes us special. Last point, and the reason I'm going on here is because I know that you guys have a lot of questions about this, and I haven't addressed all of you directly about it. With respect to response, my principal goal leading up to the election was making sure that the election itself went off without a hitch, that it was not tarnished, and that it did not feed any sense in the public that somehow tampering had taken place with the actual process of voting. And we accomplished that. That does not mean that we are not going to respond. It simply meant that we had a set of priorities leading up to the election that were of the utmost importance. Our goal continues to be to send a clear message to Russia or others not to do this to us, because we can do stuff to you. But it is also important for us to do that in a thoughtful, methodical way. Some of it we do publicly. Some of it we will do in a way that they know, but not everybody will. And I know that there have been folks out there who suggest somehow that if we went out there and made big announcements and thumped our chests about a bunch of stuff, that somehow that would potentially spook the Russians. But keep in mind that we already have enormous numbers of sanctions against the Russians. The relationship between us and Russia has deteriorated, sadly, significantly over the last several years. And so how we approach an appropriate response that increases costs for them for behavior like this in the future, but does not create problems for us, is something that's worth taking the time to think through and figure out. And that's exactly what we've done. So at a point in time where we've taken certain actions that we can divulge publicly, we will do so. There are times where the message will be directly received by the Russians and not publicized. And I should point out, by the way, part of why the Russians have been effective on this is because they don't go around announcing what they're doing. It's not like Putin's going around the world publicly saying, look what we did, wasn't that clever. He denies it. So the idea that somehow public shaming is going to be effective. I think doesn't read the thought process in Russia very well. Okay?
Did Clinton lose because of the hacking?
I'm going to let all the political pundits in this town have a long discussion about what happened in the election. Now, it was a fascinating election, so I'm sure there are going to be a lot of books written about it. I've said what I think is important for the Democratic Party going forward, rather than try to parse every aspect of the election. And I've said before, I couldn't be prouder of Secretary Clinton, her outstanding service. I think she's worked tirelessly on behalf of the American people, and I don't think she was treated fairly during the election. I think the coverage of her and the issues was troubling. But having said that, what I've been most focused on, appropriate for the fact that I'm not going to be a politician in about, was it 32 days? 31? 34?
It's crazy.
What I've said is that I could maybe give some counsel and advice to the Democratic Party, and I think that the thing we have to spend the most time on, because it's the thing we have the most control over, is how do we make sure that we are showing up in places where I think Democratic policies are needed, where they are helping, where they are making a difference, but where people feel as if they're not being heard, and where Democrats are characterized as coastal, liberal, latte sipping, politically correct, out of touch folks. We have to be in those communities, and I've seen that when we are in those communities, it makes a difference. That's how I became president. I became a U.S. Senator not just because I had a strong base in Chicago, but because I was driving around downstate Illinois and going to fish fries and sitting in VFW halls and talking to farmers. And I didn't win every one of their votes, but they got a sense of what I was talking about, what I cared about, that I was for working people, that I was for the middle class, that the reason I was interested in strengthening unions and raising the minimum wage and rebuilding our infrastructure and making sure that parents had decent child care and family leave was because my own family's history wasn't that different from theirs, even if I looked a little bit different. Same thing in Iowa. And so the question is, how do we rebuild that party as a whole so that there's not a county in any state, I don't care how red, where we don't have a presence and we're not making the argument, because I think we have the better argument. But that requires a lot of work. It's been something that I've been able to do successfully in my own campaigns. It is not something I've been able to